on Bridget, Goddess and Saint, a Little Lower East Side Irish Women's History. I'm Richard Moses of the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative, also known as LESPI. For those of you who don't know us, we're a not-for-profit volunteer organization whose mission is the preservation of the buildings, streetscapes, and culture of the Lower East Side. Some of our many projects include pushing the New York City Landmarks Commission to designate a Lower East Side historic district below Delancey Street around the Tenement Museum, saving 2 Art Deco modern buildings in the East River Park, and landmarking several Lower East Side historic settlement house buildings. So we want to start a quick poll here. It's anonymous, and we're just asking you where you all live so that we have a sense as to who our audience is here. Okay, thank you everybody who participated, and we'll share the results at the end, as I mentioned. And I now want to introduce my fellow LESPI board member and Vice President Laurel Sewell, who also happens to be the director of the East Village Community Coalition.
Thanks, Richard. Welcome everyone. I'm sorry about anyone who can't get in. We will have a link available on YouTube in a day or so. So the East Village Community Coalition is a neighborhood group. We work on mainly 3 initiatives: retail diversity, keep supporting our local businesses and storefronts, sustainability, so parks and the Avenue B open street right now, and also on preservation. So this office was the hub of the campaign to save St. Bridget's when it first started. And we'll hear more about that later in the program, but it all happened here. So we'd love to just give a few Zoom rules before we start. So if everyone please remain muted, we do have over 100 people on the call. And if you have a question, the Q&A is the best place. You're welcome to chat with each other in the chat. But Q&A is the best place for questions, which we'll have at the end of the program. So for right now, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists this evening. Grammy Award-winning vocalist, songwriter, and producer Susan McKeown immigrated to the Lower East Side in 1990. Her performances in an Irish cafe on St. Mark's Place led to an international touring and recording career that has included 16 albums, award-winning collaborations with Queen's band Mariachi Real de Mexico and the Klezmatics, and performances at Carnegie Hall, the Walt Disney Concert Hall, Glastonbury, and the Edinburgh Festival. She conceived, arranged, and produced the 2010 album Songs from the East Village that was featured on NPR's Weekend Edition and raised over $30,000 for the East Village Community School. Hers is the woman's voice singing on the audio recording in the Irish Department of New York's Tenement Museum. Today, Susan is founder and director of Kula Foundation, a Lower East Side nonprofit that creates new systems of community self-care through culture. Following her will be our first Vice President, Carolyn Radcliffe. She's the artistic director, treasurer, and one of the founders of Artistas de Loa Saida, an artist collaborative which incorporated as Art Loa Saida Foundation. She's a curator at Theater for the New City Art Gallery and worked as a development director for Downtown Music Productions. She's an avid community gardener, photographer, artist, and preservationist, and serves as president of the 9BC Tompkins Square Block Association. She has been active in many, many neighborhood organizations, such as the Committee to Save St. Bridget, which she was treasurer, and served on CB3 from November 2006 to December 2020, serving on the Parks and Landmarks Committee and chairing the Arts and Culture Subcommittee. So Susan will take it away and share her tales of the a little Irish women's history. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Richard. And thank you all for joining us. I am now trying to exit full screen for myself. Now I have it done. Great. So I'm content. And I want to thank Lesby and East Village Community Coalition for inviting me to be part of this evening, because I'm a fan of both organizations and I love Lesby events. I always follow what they're working on and what the knowledge they want to share about the community on the Lower East Side. So that's always wonderful. And to get this opportunity to collaborate with Carolyn on this project, on this presentation this evening for all of you is great, because I'm not a historian, but I care very passionately about history, and particularly social history and communities, past, present, and future. So Carolyn and I collaborated to give you different aspects of Brigid on the Lower East Side. And some of the questions I was looking to ask were, who was Brigid? Why did the Irish come to the Lower East Side in such large numbers? What set Irish women apart from the other Irish immigrant groups that arrived in New York in the 19th century? And that answer lies in part in what my late friend, the great writer Nuala O'Fuailán, herself a Lower East Side resident, once told me. And she said, the truth was Irish women couldn't wait to get away. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Brigid and Ireland to give context for who these Irish people and Irish women were when they arrived on the Lower East Side, and trace some stories of some Irish women who lived on the Lower East Side in the past and made important contributions there. And also a couple of people from the Lower East Side who weren't Irish, but were deeply influenced by the Irish community around them, because I'm always looking to learn more about the Irish voicers, but we'll find other writers who really brought Irish culture into their work. And that was because they lived surrounded by Irish people on the Lower East Side at that time. So I'd like to start with the story of my own experience. I guess we can go to slide 1 and then to slide 2. And while we do that, thanks, Richard, I want to thank my ancestors whose struggle made it possible for me to be here today. And I want to thank the ancestors of the Lower East Side. When I walk down by the river, I generally have a kind of ritual where I thank the ancestors of the land, the Lower East Side, and remember that for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, Manhattan Island was traditionally the land of the Munsee, Delaware, or Lenape tribe, and that Lower Manhattan was a meeting and trading place long before Europeans arrived for many native nations.
Let me interrupt for just 1 second. We're not seeing the slides.
Okay. Slides appear.
Richard.
I'll take a moment.
Okay, I'm not sure why I'm seeing the slides, so I'm not sure why
Yeah, we're looking at your computer screen and we see Saving St. Brigid, Carolyn Key, and we don't see Susan's slides.
Susan's slides are up at the top, Susan PowerPoint, but for some reason your cursor is stuck on Saving St. Brigid.
Yeah, and this is not what I'm seeing, so that's very confusing. So let's try it again. Hold on.
Okay, thanks, Richard.
Okay,
well,
I'm going to stop the share and we'll try it over again.
Okay.
What happens here? Sorry, everybody.
I can tell you a little story if you want while
Sure.
you're on that, Richard. Just that Brigid is one of the 3 patron saints of Ireland, the others being Patrick, of course, and Columkill. So a typical greeting, I think.
There we go.
Oh yeah, there we go. There's my ancestors.
And mine.
And yours. I'll finish up that little story. A typical greeting in Ireland, in the Irish language, would be Diogwit, God be with you. That's kind of hello. And then the response to that, it's all call and response. I mean, so much to do with Irish language and culture has to do with call and response. So the response would be, God be with you and Mary. And then the other person would say, well, God be with you and Mary and Patrick. And then the other person would go, well, God be with you and Mary and Patrick and Bridget. And then finally, if you were really getting into it, you'd say, God be with you and Mary and Patrick and Bridget and Colin Kill. And I always think of that in terms of when I first came to New York, because that's kind of the way Ireland is, and Irish dialogue goes on with people. But it was quite different when I arrived in New York as an immigrant, like fresh off the plane. And I went to someone's apartment for a cup of tea. And in Ireland, you'd say, would you like a cup of tea? And you go, oh no, I go on. Ah no, I go on, have a cup of tea, maybe a half cup. But in New York, it was like, would you like a cup of tea? And I said, ah no. And they said, okay. So I imagine that immigrants coming from Ireland, it was quite a culture shock because they didn't have TV. I grew up watching Kojak and different kind of shows, so it wasn't as much of a culture shock. So there we are, slide 1, thank you. That's my ancestors, my grandparents' names all in caps, and then all of the people from those lineages beyond. And we can go to the next slide straight away, because on one lineage, I know that our ancestors are Shields, and they lived in County Offaly and Ballyshield. Bally means town, like Balta as well, Baltimore. You can see Shield, kind of like the 5th or 6th name or word from the top on that, the Brosna River. And they lived there until about 1668, when Cromwell was in Ireland. And we'll talk a little bit about him in not too long, because Irish people have not forgotten about him. And my people were healers. I just found a wonderful video the other day that a man made about the book, which is the next slide, which is the Book of the O'Shiel. And they wrote that because Cromwell's men were moving through Ireland rapidly, clearing the land. He started up he wanted to do a kind of a reservation in the west of Ireland in a place called Connacht, one of the 4 provinces. Originally there were 5. So he moved people there, and my ancestors were one of those families. So this book they wrote in a hurry. It wasn't meant to be manuscript like the Book of Kells. They wanted to get down and collect all the they were a medicinal family. They had a hospital there and healed people with plants that grew on the bog. So this is one of the books they produced, which is in the Royal Irish Academy. And the next slide is another document I have, which was a piece of music written in 1916, and we'll touch on 1916. At the time it was written, that building, the General Post Office in Dublin, was in ruins. And my great-grandmother wrote this song, and it went out of print and was reprinted. And she was a widow with 2 sons, and had music published in Portugal and Spain in order to send money back for her son's upkeep when she was left destitute. And the next slide, we can just go through these quickly. That's me when I arrived in New York in 1991. And the next slide, I just gave this picture because Matt Dillon is in it, and he's going to be, we'll see him again later. And I was in the Irish Emigrant Vote campaign. At that time, Ireland was only one of 2 European countries that didn't have an absentee ballot. It's still that way. And then the next slide is Sinead. I found that place. It had opened, thankfully for me, just the year I got here. So that's 122 St. Mark's Place. It's currently the Holy Land Market. I started my songwriting career there with the most famous person was Jeff Buckley, but there were a whole slew of us, and we found a space there to perform. It was kind of an unofficial Irish cultural centre. There was a documentary shot by my friend, the late Jimmy Chivago, and there are moves to try and complete that documentary. So that's 122 St. Mark's Place, not Bua on the other side of that staircase. People often think that was where Sinead was. The New York Times published that photo last year, and I sent in a correction. And then I just put in a photo of me after that, which we can skip right through just to show in 1998 on my roof on the Lower East Side of the building I'm still in at 13th and A. And the next slide shows Brigid and Patrick and Colin Kill. So they're the 3 saints. And Brigid, of course, I've always known Brigid's church was in the East Village on Tompkins, on Avenue B. And I have often heard her referred to as Santa Brigida. And so I think of her presence there. And we grew up knowing there was a saint, but there's been a lot uncovered outside of the talk of her as a Catholic saint. She was never actually canonized. But there was great veneration of Brigid all over Northwestern Europe, right up to the time when the saint is supposed to have existed. And it is also the feast, as Carolyn McCrory mentioned earlier in the chat, of Imbolc. And Imbolc literally is Imbulg, and that means in the belly. So it's one of the four ancient fire festivals in the pre-Christian and pre-Celtic Ireland, I would say. They mark the different quarters of the year, and Imbulg refers to it's also a bellows that a smith uses, and Brigid is the patron of smithing, but it's like in the belly, stuff that's been gestating over the winter. Brigid's very much associated with the promise that spring is coming. It doesn't mean spring is here today, especially when there's snow, but her coming means the days are getting long, the sun is getting stronger, and the snow is going to be melting. So there's hope coming again after the darkness of winter. She's also the patron of the healing arts, fertility, I said that, poetry, prophecy, agriculture, and medicine. And the next slide is of one of my favorite images of Brigid, because I was invited to share an image of Brigid, and this is one that was created by Harry Clarke, who was one of Ireland's greatest artists. He illustrated many books. We can go to the next slide, just in case I wasn't heard that time. He illustrated many books. There it is. But he also was most famously a stained glass artist. And this is really one of his greatest works. And I'm going to speak from memory because I can't find what I had to refer to. But Harry Clarke had a studio in Dublin. I think his father was an architect. And this piece was made for the Irish government. It was called Dark Beauty. And it was supposed to be a great work about Irish culture and telling the world about how great Irish culture was. So this was his panel of St. Brigid. And the government never really accepted it. He didn't know whether they'd actually accepted it when he died. So his wife bought it back and it later got sold. So it's actually in Florida at this time. If you want to go and see it, I want to go and see it. So yeah, when I referred earlier to pre-Christianity, Brigid is connected with the time before the Celts, with the Tuatha Dé Danann, who were a dark people who came from the four corners of the sky. And they loved poetry and culture. They were all about love and community and belonging. And it was when the Celts came that the idea of the arts of war and weaponry was introduced. So the next slide is also from Harry Clarke. It's the Brigid's Cross. And while Brigid is often connected with the Trinity, when I see the cross, I think of the sun cross, the people who came from the four corners of the sky. And it makes me think of the medicine wheel, actually. And I've used that in some of my workshops with youth, because we talk about spirituality, people of all religions and none, and physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And then this next slide was sent to me today by my friend Neil O'Wheel in Dublin, and he was born in New York. He left when he was 3, and he sent me this. He spent some time, as people do, go visit the Brigidine sisters. Brigid is supposed to have, before the saint, it was there was devotion to Brigid, and it was a community of women who were connected with the land and studied under the oak tree in Kildare. Kildare means sacred wood of the oak. And there are women there who still tend sacred flame in her name. They're called the Brigidine sisters. And then the next slide shows the various spellings. I'm sure there are more. Brigid, when you see bride, it's actually the English pronunciation as we would look at it. But if we were looking at it in Irish, we'd go 2 down and see Breda with the accent on the top. It's only one accent in the Irish language. Breda, bridie, which, as Carolyn will tell you it was the name that many Irish women were called, especially serving women in New York. There might be my friend Katie on the call, a young woman in Ireland who had 3 great-grandmothers called Brigid, who all went to New York, and they all came back to Ireland. And then Brigid, and below that Brigid, the GH is silent. Brigid and Brigid, because she's also, apart from Scotland and other parts of this edge, the islands, she's also venerated in parts of Germany. And that reminds us. And then very quickly, the next 2 slides, in Dublin, there's St. Brigid's Primary School. Oh, sorry, that's, yeah, thank you. I announced it. This is Bride Street, Ivy Buildings, where my grandfather lived. The date says 1904, but before they built that, and it says above it, Shroyd Bride, which is obviously Brigid Street, they demolished a church, which is a theme tonight. They demolished a church in order to put up this building. And the next slide is the building 2 blocks away, St. Brigid's School. And that's how we know that there was a connection to Brigid in the heart of Dublin, where my family, my mother's side, goes back at least 4 generations. And the next slide, I just wanted to give you some context. One of my favorite items in the National Museum in Dublin, the archaeology one, the Breuter Boat, because Brigid is connected with smithing. And it's believed that Indigenous Irish travellers were metalsmiths who came to Ireland. And Indigenous Irish traveller culture has kind of kept the flame going in Irish culture even today, though they've suffered greatly over the last 100 years. And this is just an exquisite boat from the 1st century, found in a field, as is often the case. And we can just go quick, steadily through the next slide. There's Brigid's Well in Faughart, where she was born. The next one are the steps down to the water. Offerings left at Faughart's shrine, because when you went to a well, you often brought something with you for the ancestors, especially if you wanted healing or a favor granted, you would leave something with them. The next slide is, though Brigid was from just on the coast, she was born, she set up her monastery with her nuns here in Kildare, the sacred place of the oak. And the next slide is the well there with some Brigid's crosses that you can see people brought to the well. And then these next slides are just for context, because they're stunning. Ever since I saw these about 8 years ago in Dublin, I could not believe them, because they're the first, they're just so beautiful. The first colour, it's believed, the first colour photographs taken in Ireland. And you can see the woman she's 14 years old, Manly Toole. She ended up growing up, getting married and having many children and grandchildren who are on Facebook. And this is May 1913. So the cloak, and the next photograph, you'll see the back of the cloak, would have been something probably put on specially for this photograph. Because there are other things about her and the people we'll see in the next couple of images that we'll see there was great poverty. I've been reading a book, it's in my apartment on 13th and A, about what women did for the 20,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. And they were still doing it in Connemara in 1913. And I love the spinning wheel. I actually learned to spin wool on the Lower East Side in an apartment on Delancey, way above the street. So many of these women would have come to New York. Like they never would have been to Dublin. They would have traveled to Cork, maybe to Derry, and gotten on a boat. I was told by a musician I know in New York about how his parents came. His mother, her father died, she was 15. And she, with her mother, laid out, cleaned the body. They prepared him for burial. They buried him. And the next day, her mother gave her the money to go to Cork and get on a ship to New York. And this man is, he's, what age is he? Probably late 60s. So it didn't change that much for a long time. And what we do know about a lot of these women now is, while there was this huge influx of immigrants during the times of the Great Hunger, after that, women just kept coming in bigger numbers. And one of the things that distinguishes Irish immigrants from all the other immigrant groups that came to New York in the late 1800s was that Irish women came in huge numbers alone, and most of them were aged 15 to 24. So for every 8 Irish men, 10 women came. And various reasons for this. The whole system had changed after the Great Hunger, the social system. People got married later. There was less money. There had been a system where the farm got divided up between all the sons, but now the farm got given to one son and there was a dowry for one daughter. So options were limited. They could become a nun. They could leave. We can go through the next 3 slides. And I'll catch up with my notes, but they're beautiful cottages. These were in Claddagh in Galway, just outside Galway city. Claddagh means, I think it means harbour. It's like to do with fishing. And it's also, you might know the Claddagh ring, which was the old, I've heard that it was a wedding ring, but it certainly comes from that place. And Claddagh just, you know, you can walk to it from the middle of Galway city, but it was always kind of separate and apart. And these photos were taken by Marguerite Mespoulet and Madeleine Mignon Alba as part of a worldwide project entitled The Archives of the Planet that was funded by a philanthropist, Albert Kahn. And the director of the Albert Kahn Museum said, these were not works of reportage or ethnography, nor an attempt to produce works of art. The aim was simply to record human beings in all their diversity, living humble lives worthy of respect. And from this respect, Kahn hoped would arise the universal peace to which he aspired. I just want to say, I saw some questions even before I started, and I'm not looking at the chat, and I'm looking forward to answering the questions at the end, but I will be sending out, I've talked with Laura and Richard about sending out some references to whatever comes up. I've already started preparing that. So the next slide, I would like to talk just a little bit more about culture, who we are. This harp was made by John Egan, one of the greatest harp makers in 1822, who is, you know, well, I should start at the beginning. Up until the Middle Ages, the harper was an important person in Irish society. I mean, the harp is in many cultures, but in Ireland, it's been for about 2,000 years, and it's a tough instrument to play because they're tough strings, gut strings, and you had to play it with long nails. One of our greatest harpers, Carolyn, was blinded by smallpox, and that's why he took up the harp. But boy, you really had to be devoted to it in order to pluck the strings and make the beautiful sounds that do come from the Irish harp. This is a portable one that musicians could take around to different places, but it's very innovative. It's different from all other harps. It had wire strings, and the players had to use a complicated system of damping because of the long-lasting resonance. No Gaelic monarch or high noble of the period would venture far outside the castle without his entourage. That included a bard known as a filla, who composed elaborate Gaelic verse. I often think of like griots because they had to know the lineage and talk about the person who was paying them. And it also included a vocalist, a racara, who read or sang the poems, and a harper, crittera, who provided musical accompaniment. Tunes that they composed in honor of their patrons were called planksties. And these times were truly a golden age for harpers, for they were viewed as indispensable by their lords and patrons and treated as highly valued members of the household. Some harps were magnificently carved. So we're talking about the earlier period before John Egan started to make harps, and studded with precious gems. But all that began to change in the 16th century. So we're going to talk a little about the Tudor conquest. Queen Elizabeth I issued a proclamation to hang Irish harpers and destroy their instruments to prevent insurrection. So that was at a time when the Archbishop of Armagh, a leading royal councillor, described how he'd ridden 30 miles through parts of the Ulster and Leinster borderlands. Leinster is the place associated with Brigid, without seeing or hearing a sign of life. Houses were burnt out, villages uninhabited, and all the cornfields destroyed. Nowhere were there any people or cattle, just an eerie silence. Famine reigned. A generation later, the poet, planter, and former vice-regal secretary Edmund Spenser recalled the dire effects of military campaigning in large parts of Munster, that's in the south, during the Desmond War of 1579 to 83. In short space, he wrote, there were none, people nor animals, almost left, and a most populous and plentiful country suddenly left void. And having accompanied his master, Viceroy Mountjoy, on expeditions through all 4 provinces after 1600, Fynes Morrison later recorded, no spectacle was more frequent in the ditches of towns and in the wasted countries than to see multitudes of these poor people dead, their mouths coloured green by eating nettles and ducks. So we know that part of the strategy in Ireland occasionally even recommended the inducement of famine in troublesome regions as a short-term military experiment. And we can go on to the next slide to talk about the curious thing about Elizabeth I, because this is the royal seal, the second seal of Elizabeth from 1856, the earliest English Great Seal, which bore the Irish harp. You can see it above the horse's tail as a sign of the union of the kingdoms. And records of the Tudor court at Whitehall indicate that the monarchs themselves were eager to project the message that Ireland was an important part of the crown's dominions and that Irish were full subjects of the Tudor state. From 1541, medals and insignia for Henry VIII celebrated the creation of the Kingdom of Ireland. And then this seal, Elizabeth I had displayed proudly the harp on it. Mary I had a Gaelic Irishman, Conor Mcdermott, as one of her personal attendants, and a Gaelic harper from Kildare by the name of O'Rourke may have played music at her court. Through her direct patronage, Irish tunes became popular. So for a number of years, a musician from North County Dublin was in great demand in London and its vicinity. Early in her reign, she decreed that the Bible should be translated into Irish, all the better to spread Protestantism. She even expressed a desire to learn the rudiments of the Irish language. So you can read plenty online about these really interesting periods of Irish history, and I've always been interested in the impact it had on cultural identity. But the most famous person who impacted cultural identity negatively is probably the person I'm going to talk about next, and I'm just going to check the slide. Yeah, Oliver Cromwell. So I mentioned earlier that he tried to establish a wild Irish reservation in Connacht in the west. He told people they could go to hell or to Connacht, where the rockiest land was. It wasn't the rich land of the other provinces. His campaign lasted in Ireland from 1649 to 1658. He confiscated land and there was destruction of food supplies. I don't have to read this to you because you can see it. I think most of you can actually. Yeah, sorry, I'll read. Consigned the Catholic population to Connacht to locate English settlers on the other land. And most of that land would not have been owned in the way it came to be owned. It was kind of shared. It was in smaller communities, groups, chiefdoms kind of thing. I can't find the word in my head, but it wasn't the same kind of ownership. There were lots of families that took care of land, more like that, but there wasn't the kind of concept of buying and owning and selling land that came in then. Some were sent to Barbados, and about 20% of the population died by starvation. I think I have a quote from him on the next slide, but no, I don't. So we won't go there. I'm going to read the quote here. Yes, he declared to the Irish clergy in 1650, "You are part of the Antichrist, whose kingdom the scriptures so expressly speaks should be laid in blood, and ere it be long, you must all of you have blood to drink, even the dregs of the cup of fury and the wrath of God, which will be poured out unto you." Oliver Cromwell took the persecution of harpers to new extremes. In the 1650s, he ordered all harps and organs throughout Ireland to be destroyed. In Dublin alone, the authorities seized 500 harps and burned them. Harpers in cities large and small were forbidden to congregate. We can go next to the penal laws. I'm moving very fast through this. Some of you will know a lot of this history, but these are key things brought in. Sorry, I brought the harp back again, and why not? It's lovely to look at the beautiful harp, because that is from the period when the penal laws started to be repealed, and the harping tradition was almost gone, and they had a festival of harping in 1792, and it's believed there were only about 11 harpers left, and they gathered them in Belfast, and Edward Bunting, I think he was 19 years old, was hired to write down the tunes that they played, and that led to the bringing back of harp music, thankfully. And then John Egan had a great job when he came along, wonderful craftsman who started making harps, and there was a resurgence because, as we'll see in that next slide, the penal laws. Oh yeah, the penal laws were already gone through, and that's fine. The penal laws were just laws brought in that made it, for example, a Catholic couldn't own a horse worth more than £5. And if you know anything about Lament for Art O'Leary, you'll know that was a big deal. And also they couldn't get a proper burial. So Daniel O'Connell, who was a big part of repealing the penal laws, bought a cemetery so that Catholics could get proper burials in Dublin in 1828. So we're moving forward to the Great Hunger, and it used to be called the Famine. People refer to it as the famine still, I know, and the potato famine, but the reality was that famine was only a part of it, and there was lots of food grown in Ireland at the time, lots of healthy cattle and sheep, and they were shipped out under armed guard. They were loaded onto barges on the canals that had been constructed to bring them up to Dublin and onto ships to take them out. And between 1845 and 49, immigration exploded because the famine, people faced starvation, death. There's lots to say about it, but at the beginning of it, there were about I think it was 8.2 million in the population. The worst years were like 1845 to 1849. And by the middle of the next decade, the population had gone down to from 5 and then down to 2.8 million eventually. And it's only gotten back up to 5 in recent decades. Some things that changed were Catholicism was mainly practiced by the middle classes. The poor people didn't have as many, there weren't as many priests, and they were in, far-flung rural areas. So there was a mixture of Catholicism and the folk memory and beliefs and worship of characters like goddesses like Brigid, and calling on the elements and the spirit and connection to the land. There was great belief in that as well. And of course, most of the people affected by the famine were those who were poor. So aspects of Catholicism changed. Conditions were unspeakably horrendous, with countless parents and children clustered together in holes in the ground, with nothing to eat, nothing to wear, delirious with exhaustion and fever, just waiting to die. And in the middle of that, a woman from New York came to Ireland. So she's in the next slide. And her name is Asenath Hatch Nicholson, and she lived on the Lower East Side, and she ran a vegan boarding house with her husband. She was from Vermont, and she heard about what was happening in Ireland, and she traveled over there and was horrified with what she saw, and ended up sending back to New York for help to be sent over in the form of food. And she went over twice and wrote 2 books about it. And they're in the next 2 slides. The first one is Ireland's Welcome to the Stranger. When she saw what was happening, she happened to arrive at the beginning of the Great Hunger, wrote a book and got the book out as soon as she can so she could let people know about the conditions. She had them published in New York. And the next book, she went back again and then wrote Annals of the Famine in Ireland, 1847, 48, and 49. These have been edited by Professor Maureen Murphy. And then she came back to New York and she ended up, I think she died in New Jersey, but she had lived on the Lower East Side and seen all these Irish arriving and become curious. So she had gone over with Bibles, but ended up sending over food. And we saw earlier the photographs of the Irish as they were leaving Ireland. The next photograph shows them getting on a ship. And then the next slide is a graphic novel I've had in development for a while called New York Rising, which shows some of the Irish immigrants arriving at New York, seeing the Statue of Liberty, and then taking their few belongings and disembarking in New York. And then the next slide shows them arriving and the infamous 5 Points, where there was a thriving gangland culture. And below that, in that photo, you can see some of the people hanging out, looking for work opportunities. And often there were very few opportunities, particularly for women. And sometimes women got off that boat and were never heard from again. So another enterprising woman, Charlotte Grace O'Brien, you can go to the next slide, please, saw this and wanted to change. She was a philanthropist. She was the daughter of William Smith O'Brien, who had been a patriot and had been very active in a rebellion in 1848. And he had been sent to Australia, but he did well. And his daughter was a philanthropist and concerned about Ireland and her heritage. And she saw these women coming over and that things were happening to them. So she was very interested in strategy. And she went to Ireland to see if she could have positive impact there. And after that, she decided to travel back to New York, and she traveled incognito on the White Star Line, so that she could see the conditions of the poor Irish traveling over for herself. And after that, on her recommendation, the White Star Line started to separate single women who were traveling alone on the ships. And then she set up a mission for immigrant girls in Watson House, which is at 7 State Street. And she had a Father Reardon purchase the building for her. The original owner had been a man called Watson. It went through a few owners, and then O'Riordan intended to tear it down and put another building in its place, but he died before that happened. So it's still standing there today, right at the tip of Manhattan when you get off the Staten Island ferry. And it's thought that over 100,000 young women, most of them Irish, went through the mission for immigrant girls. They were met by clerks at the ships because the women were being met by other less scrupulous men. And they were trained how to be maidservants. And some of them were given jobs, and many of them went to live with family, and many of those family were living up near where the shipyards were, around the dry dock area of the Lower East Side. So we'll go to the next slide, and we can just go, oh yeah, you can see the home for immigrant girls with all the girls outside it. And the next slide is some of the people connected with it also. And the next slide shows us that there really was, there were signs in the newspapers saying help wanted, no Irish need apply. That has been established as fact. Some of these phrases have been going around in recent years. Some people thought there was an expression, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, but that is not true. There is no evidence of that. And some people said, oh, they never said no Irish need apply, but we know from the work of Mick Maloney and others, he actually sings a song called that. There were plenty of places that did not want to hire Irish people. And the next slide shows Mulberry Bend, where a lot of the Irish gangs were very active. And below that, Jacob Rees photo of some homeless boys, some boys living homeless in that next slide on the Lower East Side. And after that, also Jacob Rees on the Lower East Side, some women, I think there was a typhoid outbreak, and they were lodging in a police station. at that time. And the next slide shows a photograph I just found of some happy immigrants who had just arrived and were very happy to have disembarked in New York. So the next slide is actually an image of James Connolly from an event that I ran as part of a festival we did in 2016 of Irish culture to commemorate Ireland's rising of 1916 that would not have happened as it did had it not been for New York. And James Connolly was a big part of that. I mean, when you look at the signatories of the proclamation, there were 7 of them and 5 of them had spent a lot of time in New York. James Connolly, particularly on the Lower East Side and outside Cooper Union. So we did this event because when he first came to New York, it was a big news in New York, and he spoke at Cooper Union. And then he became very involved in organizing workers' organizations. And he wrote for the Harp magazine. And at one point, somebody published a racist article in the magazine, and he wrote a response to it and preached anti-racism straight away. And he became the editor of the Harp. And he said, the worker is the slave of the capitalist society, and the female worker is the slave of that slave. And it's important because he learned a lot of strategy in New York, as did Thomas Clark, who lived in Greenpoint. And they both went back to go back and do more work in Ireland to really look for the liberation of Irish people. That's what they were about. And they influenced many people in New York, and some of the people they met went on to make it part of their work to work on their own independence, because when they went back to Ireland in 1916, they took over that building I showed at the beginning on my great-grandmother's sheet music, the General Post Office, and many other buildings in Dublin. And things didn't go as planned, but they were determined, and they held these buildings. Some of the buildings got destroyed because they wanted to make a point, and they wanted to hold them for a week so that then they could make a case for the League of Nations gathering that they knew was coming up in 1919, to make a case for them as a small nation, like other small nations, to have freedom. You can see in the next image how treasured James Connolly was. He was well known in New York. And this image is of an Irish Relief Fund bazaar from October 1916. Because what happened was, after the Rising, they took the leaders of the Rising and they executed them. And James Connolly he was injured, so he was unable to stand. So they propped him up in his stretcher in order to execute him. And there are many other aspects of that incredible story about its connection with New York, and money and support and just knowledge about organizing and mobilizing people in communities. That was part of the Rising. And there's something I'm forgetting. Oh yes, and that was that at the mission for immigrant girls, one of the people working there at one point was Rose Mcdermott, and her brother was one of the people executed as well. And she was very passionate, like others, about raising money and sending it back, because a lot of Irish women's voices were kind of silenced. Even Irish musicians, women who were political organizers in 1880, who took over from the men in Ireland at one point. We've lost, we don't have as much history about them as we do about the things that the men were doing, but they did very important work to support these movements. And a lot of that has only started to be properly documented in the last decade, in fact, leading up to 1916. And Rose Mcdermott was Sean Mcdermott's sister, and 5 of his sisters moved to New York. And she was the founder of the mission to Irish immigrant girls at Watson House. And that I know about through the research of Professor Maureen Murphy. And her recounting of female participation in Ireland's history recounted language reminiscent of epic poetry. She believed that women's traditional willingness to participate in dangerous activities and rise to each challenge armed their New York sisters to support the Women's Council and the Irish Volunteers. And here's an excerpt from a speech she gave in New York. "The land of Ireland is separated from the land of England by one of Ireland's angriest seas, the Irish Sea. There is no reason why the Irish should not be given their independence. Note the word, independence, nothing else and nothing less. Poor Ireland, situated as she is situated, must suffer, and has suffered because she had and has no past of interest to other nations in the modern world." And further, Rose believed that the unification of different strands of Republican thought could merge Catholic and Protestant women into one visionary organization. I'd just like to say, give a quote from President Obama about, in fact, we can go to the next slide, which is of Rose's brother, Sean, who was executed. Thank you. President Obama said about the 1916 proclamation, which has so much about America in it, and particularly we think from Connolly that it begins Irish men and Irish women, and talks about cherishing all the children of the nation equally. President Obama said it's built around religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities, and cherishing all the children of the nation equally. It's a universal value, like the ones in America's own founding documents, that compel us to continually look forward, that give us the chance to change, and dares us, American and Irish alike, to keep toiling towards our better selves. And when that happened, there was a woman who had lived much of her life on the Lower East Side, who was at that time about to become one of the United States' greatest poets because of a poem that she wrote while living with a Jewish family in a room that was 5 by 7 on or near Hester Street, and her name was Lola Ridge. She was born in Dublin, and when she was 4, her parents split up, so her mother took her to New Zealand, married again. That marriage didn't go too well for Lola, and Lola came to the United States. And Louise Birkenau has described Ridge's work today as the buried history within the buried history, and her discussions of women artists have been forgotten. But Lola wrote this poem, The Tidings, and it's the last poem in her book of poems called The Ghetto, which is mostly about the Lower East Side. But this is about, subtitled Easter 1916, and she says, "Censored lies the mimic truth, censored truth as pale as fear. My heart is like a rousing bell, and but the dead to hear. My heart is like a mother bird, circling ever higher. My heart and the nest tree rimmed about by a forest fire. My heart is like a lover foiled by a broken stair. They are fighting tonight in Sackville Street, and I am not there." And it's full of the cry of the immigrant, immigrant's longing. The next slide is of her, actually, and her longing to be back there, to belong, because isn't that what it's all about? When we come to another country, we seek to belong. We look for our people, or we don't look, we try to get away from our people because we're stuck in a place of unbelonging at that time. And the next slide, I'm just going to go off book here because I have so much here I want to tell you, and it's probably best if I just tell you without looking at the script. Albizu Campos. Now, he is very heavily connected with the Lower East Side. The housing development, the NYCHA housing development on 13th and C is named after him, and Campos Garden on 12th Street is named after him. There's a beautiful mural of him on the corner right now of Avenue C and 12th Street. And Albizu Campos came from Puerto Rico. He was a brilliant student and won a scholarship to university in Vermont. And from there, he went to Harvard. I believe he's the first Puerto Rican to go to Harvard. And then he enlisted in the army. I think he volunteered. But he experienced such racism in the army during World War II. It changed his view of what it meant to be Puerto Rican and to be American. And he had met 2 Irish priests who told him all about James Connolly, and he became very interested in Connolly's strategies and organizing. So Connolly and Campos are very linked on the Lower East Side. I always think of them walking around our streets because things they learned through the Lower East Side and the community there as it was at that time. And our next slide is, I'm excited to see, Yip Harburg. Yeah, so I mentioned that mural on C and 12th. Well, Yip Harburg grew up in that building. I don't have the street number to hand, but if you're standing on Avenue C between 11th and 12th, and there's the supermarket behind you, and that building in the middle of the block, which is still an apartment building, that's where Yip Harburg lived as a very small child. And then his family moved down to the place that, when I was talking with Patricia Melvin yesterday, thanks Patricia, I always consider the heart of the Lower East Side, and that's 9th and C. So Yip's family moved down to a building just on 9th Street, just off C, looking across at what is now La Plaza Cultural. And I used to see Yip's name and this poster in the 14th Street post office. And then I realized he's the guy who wrote Somewhere Over the Rainbow. But he grew up in great poverty. They were so poor and so cold that he went to Tompkins Square Library to read. And he came across all these pieces of Irish literature, like James Stephen's book about the Crock of Gold. And he put that into not The Wizard of Oz, for which he's most famous, but Finian's Rainbow, which was had the first mixed race cast on Broadway, and was a very political play and a very ambitious work. And it was inspired by his reading of George Bernard Shaw, Sean O'Casey, and other Irish writers he came across in Tompkins Square Library. He went to school, the next slide, in PS24. And we can go to the next slide straight away because I'm conscious of the time. This guy lived across the street from the Harburgs, and this is Henry Roth. And Henry Roth wrote a novel called Call It Sleep, which Time magazine has called one of the greatest works of literature of the last century. And his connection with Ireland is that he was greatly inspired by Joyce, and some of the characters in his book, such as a policeman, are Irish characters that he knew and was surrounded by growing up at 9th and C on the Lower East Side. The last chapter is set at 10th and D and is very like Joyce in the stream of consciousness writing that he employs there. And the next slide is of Bella Cohen, or Spiewak, who came here as a small child, the daughter of a single mom. And in her book Streets, about her life near Hester Street, and lovely stories written when she was 23. And of course, she became famous as a writer of musical theatre. Kiss Me Kate was her most famous one. She writes about the Irish songs that the girls used to sing on the Lower East Side. And then the next slide is O'Donnell Way. That's at 7th Street and C, and that's named after the next person in the next slide, Mae O'Donnell, who's on the right with Martha Graham. It's this slide and the next one, which is quite beautiful. And Mae O'Donnell, her people were from Donegal, and she actually was born in California, but came here and lived on the Lower East Side, went back to San Francisco, but then came back and lived the rest of her days here and ran a music school. She lived here with her husband, a composer. The next slide is one that Carolyn gave me, James Stephens, who inspired Yip Harburg. It's a beautiful drawing. I think it's from Kula Press, the printing press, which is one of the organizations that, one of the cultural entities that inspires our organization. But it reminds me about how dance is important for relieving trauma and the Irish crossroads. And I wanted to put that in there because the next slide is about a man who lived in New York and drove cabs around the Lower East Side, Jimmy Gralton. He was inspired by James Connolly and all the movement around the Rising in 1916, and he went back to Ireland and organised and opened up a hall on his family's land and played jazz music. There's a film called Jimmy's Hall you can look up. It's a true story. He played jazz music, but the priests and the authorities didn't like it. They didn't want it to be part of the Ireland that they were creating. They were concerned that people were getting very sexual with this jazz dance and all of this stuff. So he was actually deported, even though, and I think even today, he's the only Irish citizen who was ever deported. And because he had served time in the Irish Army, he had a US passport. So this is a photograph of him being removed from the local police station. And the next couple of slides just show the Lower East Side at that time in the 30s, Lower East Side shanties. I think these are Hines photographs. And of course, McSorley's old ale house. I used to live on top of that and I felt like I was smelling the beer of 100 years. We're almost there, folks. This is we can click on through to that photograph of unemployed men and the next one of McSorley's. And then the next one is a newspaper article I came across. I love researching and I usually keep all the references. I can't find where I found this one. It's a story of a man who took one look at the East River, an Irish man, and he decided it was too dirty. So he said, I want to die. I've nothing to live for, but I'll be blasted if I'll drown in such dirty water. And then he was removed to Bellevue Hospital, which is where Jimmy Gralton died in 1945. And just to go back to some of the things that were happening for Irish women at the time, because they still kept coming. The infant mortality rates in mother and baby homes, if you Google that, there was a huge report released 2 weeks ago. It looks like the mortality rate for women who had children out of marriage, they were put into these prisons. That's what they were, because if you escaped, the police brought you back, and the mortality rate was 4 times what it was in other families. So there's plenty to read about that online. And the next slide is an image from one of those mother and baby homes. They were run by nuns. And the next slide is one of Grace Farrell. That's her on the right. She grew up in one of those mother and baby homes, and her mother left her there because it was the best thing she could do for her at the time, she believed. That's what a lot of these women would have believed, because there was no support for most of them. And she grew up in a mother and baby home in Drogheda on the East Coast, not far from where Bridget was born. And she wanted to come to the United States. And she did eventually. And she came to the Lower East Side. The next slide is of her on Avenue B. She was an artist, and she spent a lot of time in Tompkins Square Park. And she had some addiction, like a lot of Irish people struggle with because of the history of intergenerational trauma. And she ended up, she had a child on the Lower East Side, but she went through a lot of different things and sometimes was homeless. And in 2011, she was found, she died on a very cold February night in 2011 on the steps of St. Brigid's Church. So I just wanted to put her photo there because she was an artist, a very creative person who had a lot to contribute. And that was clear in the various newspaper articles that were written about her after she died. And I like to always try and keep in mind the various strands to do with culture and creativity and expression when looking at social history. So I'm very grateful. I'm going to finish up with the last slide. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I'll hand over to Carolyn and just let you know that our work is co-creating new systems of community self-care through culture. And we're getting ready to launch a Lower East Side online festival, multicultural festival I've been planning to do last May in person. Now it's going to be online. If you want more information, our website is there. You can sign up to receive information, or follow me or Kula Foundation on Facebook or any of those places. And you can write to me at contact@kulafoundation.com. I've really enjoyed this. I look forward to Carolyn's now, and Carolyn is going to tell us all about the church, which I have loved to walk in. And I've actually sung in the church. Mary Ann Pierce brought me in once and I got to sing, and the wooden acoustics, it's just magnificent. So I'll go on mute now. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to change presentations here. It's kind of like the old days when they used to change reels in the movie theaters. Everyone just bear with us for a second. Let me see where this went.
While we're waiting, Susan, people were asking about the music
Yes.
from the beginning. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, and I do want to say, yes, I knew Yip Harburg was Jewish. I was just talking about not the bit of him that was Irish, but how he was influenced by Irish culture. And I love to hear about Jewish and Irish cultures mixing up together. And thank you. Today is the birthday of James Joyce, as it is of James Higgins, our friend on 10th Street who took that photo of me in the flyer. And the music at the beginning was from one of my greatest influences. Unfortunately, I didn't know her when she was alive, and she didn't die very long ago. Ethna Ní Ullachan and Ní Hulahan, who was in a group called La Lu. And I will put that in the, I can't put it in the chat box, I think, but maybe I can send it to you, Laura, so we can put that in during this.
You can put it in the chat.
Okay, great. And
Yep.
it will be on the page of references that we send out, links to what I've talked about. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Susan.
Thank you.
Missed the cover slide.
This is the first one we have.
Oh, okay. I call this presentation "Saving St. Brigid: Why the Irish American Community Rallied to the Cause." St. Brigid Church was founded May 20th, 1848. Its cornerstone was set September 10th, 1848, and it was dedicated December 2nd, 1949. The Irish immigrants, many of whom were famine survivors and who worked in the shipyards along the East River known as the Dry Drop, built St. Brigid. Next slide. The architect was an Irish American architect. He was 25 at the time, Patrick Keeley. He designed the church. He cast the shipwrights' faces in plaster and mounted them above the pilasters as though they were the 12 apostles. It is said that he used the analogy of a ship's hull to get the shipwrights to construct the rib vaulting above the nave of the church. Next slide. The increase of Irish immigration to the US had totaled almost 2 million in the late 1840s, increasing from 40 to 85%. New York City's Irish population increased to 25% of the total city residents. This tide of immigrant labor swelled the membership of Nativity Parish at 572 East 4th Street, and in the summer of 1848, Bishop John Hughes approved a new parish to be dedicated to Mary of the Gale, St. Brigid, a saint for whom the Irish had great devotion. Many of the Irish worked on the docks located at Avenue D between East 8th and East 9th Street, a scant 2 blocks from the church. The ironworks factory was on East 13th Street. St. Brigid occupied a prominent site that could be viewed throughout the area. It could be seen through Tompkins Square Park as all the way down to Astor Place. There weren't a lot of trees in Tompkins Square Park at that time because it had been commandeered as a parade ground for the New York State Militia in the 1840s with the Mexican War. And again, in the 1860s, during the Civil War, it was used as a parade ground at a military encampment for the 69th. They lived, the shipwrights, they lived in tenements and small row houses that abounded in the area between Avenue A and D. Next slide. Due to the prejudices against the Irish at that time, Father Kane, who was the pastor at Nativity and the first pastor of St. Brigid, had a great deal of difficulty obtaining land, which he was able to eventually purchase from Julia Winthrop, a Stuyvesant heir. And it's the land on between 8th and 7th Street that's right across from Tompkins Square Park that was part of the Stuyvesant's holdings. The Nativist, or Know Nothings Party, is a Protestant-based organization that feared Catholicism's inroads into the United States. They had burned St. Mary's on Sheriff Street on Guy Fawkes Day, November the 5th, 1831, and were threatening to continue attacks on Irish churches. In 1836, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, an Irish fraternal organization, began their first New York chapter in response to the burning of St. Mary's and other acts of violence against clergy and property. Archbishop Hughes was forced to assemble his flock against anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant mob violence that threatened the churches. This necessity to defend the church against mob violence was not uncommon. It culminated in the Know Nothing Party organizing a march as they chanted epitaphs such as "Patties for the Pope." The vigilantes were determined to burn Catholic churches to the ground. Bishop Hughes responded by writing New York City Mayor James Harper, one of the partners in Harper's and Collins, who was also an ardent nativist, that should one Catholic come to harm or should one Catholic business be molested, we will turn the city into a second Moscow. He was referring to Moscow after Napoleon when it was burned to the ground. Hughes decided to arm the Roman Catholic Ancient Order of Hibernians and position them on the walls of the cemetery surrounding Old St. Patrick's Cathedral to thwart these attempts. He also threatened to have armed volunteers on the roof of every Catholic church to repel the nativist vigilantes. Hughes became known as Dagger Jack because he refused to be intimidated by the threats of violence against his parishioners. This is a flag at the bottom of the slide. Native Americans, beware of foreign influence. In some ways, reading this history, it's almost like a repeat of what we just went through on the 6th. I mean, it's like, yeah, I guess we have come so far. So Richard, next slide. In the summer of 1848, Bishop Hughes approved a new parish to be dedicated to Mary of Gales, St. Brigid, a saint for whom the Irish had great devotion. On 9/10, he laid the cornerstone for St. Brigid. The building was completed and dedicated a mere 15 months later on December the 2nd, 1849. A recent immigrant, the Irish-American architect Charles Patrick Keeley of Williamsburg, had been chosen to design the church, and he completed it in record time. He's reputed to have been a master carver, and the organ case and the reredos at St. Brigid were a testament to his skill. St. Brigid is the oldest of Keeley's churches still standing, as though many have been lost to fire or demolition. So that's the way St. Brigid used to look. The organ is missing in action because it was removed from the church, and nobody seems to know really where it is, which is a shame because it was really incredibly beautiful. So the next slide, Richard. St. Brigid would have been built before Cooper Union in pre-Civil War times, a mere 6 blocks from where Abraham Lincoln campaigned on February 27, 1860, in which he argued that the founding fathers had little use for popular sovereignty and had repeatedly sought to restrict slavery. He insisted that morality required opposition to slavery and rejected any groping for some middle ground between the right and wrong. Next slide. St. Brigid was built of the same brownstone materials as the Church of Ascension, 1841, First Presbyterian, 1844 to 46. Both of these are on Fifth Avenue between 10th and 12th Streets. St. George's, J.P. Morgan's Church, 1850s on East 16th Street, and Calvary Episcopal Church on Park and 20th in 1848, designed by James Renwick, whose father had developed Gramercy Park. Obviously, the Irish put a great deal of pride in composition and didn't stint on the construction materials. It was also a statement about the neighborhood residents that they could have as fine a church as the more affluent neighborhoods. No small feat in those days for a working class neighborhood surviving in an era of anti-Irish sentiment. First, you see on the left the Church of the Ascension, First Presbyterian on 12th Street, a picture of St. George's with its steeples before they burned, and a picture of Calvary Episcopal with steeples. So, putting that church together and doing it in 15 months and having the same type of facade, same type of steeples as much more affluent areas is totally making a statement about we're here and we're going to make it. So, Richard, next slide, please. Many of the Irish parishioners worked on the docks located on Avenue D and East 8th and East 9th Street, a scant 2 blocks from the church. The ironworks was on 13th Street. St. Brigid occupied its prominent site. And if you can imagine where Cooper Union is, you could see St. Brigid all the way across. I mean, that was making quite a statement. to the neighborhood and to the natives that we're here to stay. So by the mid 19th century, the shoreline along the East River between 13th Street and Corlear's Hook represented the greatest concentration of shipbuilding activity in the country. The rise of the great shipyards coincided with the Great Famine in Ireland. Thousands of Irish carpenters brought their shipbuilding skills to the yards, settling in the blocks behind them from Avenue D to Avenue B. In short order, the Irish population became the cultural and political establishment of the day in the Lower East Side. The image is of a ship in dry dock. It looks like it was a clipper. Um, so it's, if you can imagine, the East River came up to Avenue D, and these were the docks that you saw there. The public housing was built, I think, in 1936, and Jacob Riis was started, and that's where it was filled in, and the river was extended, or the land was filled and extended out. So it would have been quite a different scene, and that you could see from with all the mast of the different ships. Okay, next slide. The increase in Irish immigration to the US totaled almost 2 million in the late 1840s, increasing from 40% to 85%. New York City's Irish population increased 25% of total residents. The tide of immigrant labor swelled the membership of Nativity Parish at 572 East 4th. The image is of what the interior of a tenement looked like. Housing was primarily in recently constructed tenements and small row houses. Many did not have water or sanitary facilities, and often large families of 8 to 12 people were housed in small apartments. Morrison says that the working conditions of the shipwrights and the ancillary trades were next to slavery. This was complicated when slavery was finally abolished in 1827. Around the same time, the immigrant shipwrights from Great Britain and Germany began arriving in large numbers. These immigrants immediately found work in the shipyards, building ships which carried more immigrants to the shipyards. And so it went. Morrison writes that these immigrants were responsible for spreading radical ideas of rights of labor, socialistic reforms, free love, community of interest, and the whole lot of it. The immigration swelled to 80,000 and more during the famine years. Richard, slide. The traditional craftsmen petitioned the city council to make a law limiting the workday to 10 hours. They won and erected a bell at Manhattan Market at the foot of Stanton Street. The LAS overcame the rivalry between the shipyards around Manhattan Island, building steamships such as those around Corlear's Hook, and still engaged in the building of clipper ships. In 1833, they formed the New York Journeyman Shipwrights and Caulkers Benevolent Society in 1833, and together they erected a bigger bell to alert both districts in a vacant lot on Lewis and Fifth Street. There were several shipyards at that time which had no monitor other than the mechanic's bell, and during the boom period, it was a sight to behold the hundreds that came in haste. They did not walk from the yards and shops on their ways to their home, that were mainly in the vicinity at the evening tap of the bell. A stranger would be surprised where they all came from in such a short time. The marine engine works and the smaller factories added to their quota of workmen to the small army. Next slide. The Civil War era and the draft riots, which were July 11th to the 16th, 1863, is really sort of complicated. The draft law was passed in 1862 and it was implemented in 1863. In July 11th was when it was to go into effect. The Civil War started in April of 1861 when secessionists attacked Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The Union and the 69th Irish Regiment, formed in 1849 from New York City, was sent into battle. They lost the highest number of men of any New York State regiment, 755 according to one account. They were dubbed the Fighting Irish by Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who was impressed with their bravery in battle. In 1863, the draft lottery that was to be implemented on July 11th, and the riots erupted. The law allowed people to pay $300 to avoid serving in the army, an amount far beyond what a working man could afford. At that time, blacks were not considered citizens and could not be drafted. Resentments were inflamed by newspaper articles, so many of the dock workers barricaded the streets, attacked blacks, and made incursions into well-to-do neighborhoods where looting occurred and buildings were set on fire. There's one image showing the no draft sign as they were burning. The Roosevelts were apparently very concerned about their houses, their mansions that were within the area that the Irish were burning. On this map over here on the right, you see the areas of the fires. 10th Street to 14th Street were barricaded by the workers, by the Irish. Next slide. The image of Tompkins Square Park with St. Brigid in the background is from 1865. The park had been used as military parade grounds and encampment during the Civil War, so most of the trees had been removed. The gazebo and fence were new installations after the end of the war to herald in a return to normalcy, but there were many widows and orphans left in the neighborhood as a result of the Civil War. Patricia Melvin's painting portrays the Fighting 69's memorial mass at St. Brigid in 1865 to honor their 755 men lost in the war. The rector of St. Brigid, Father Mooney, had been the chaplain for the Fighting 69 and gone with them to Virginia when they were the only U.S. regiment that did not flee from the Battle of Bull Run. Next slide. The Italian immigrants who fled here in the 1870s onward used the basement of St. Brigid to hold Mass until they were able to obtain the property between 11th and 12th Street, where Mary Help of Christians was built. The first Ukrainian Mass in the U.S. was held in St. Brigid in 1898. Immigrant groups cooperated, and non-English immigrants were grateful to the pastor of St. Brigid for allowing them to have a place to worship in their own language. With the building of the Brooklyn Bridge and the decline of the shipyards, these groups moved on from St. Brigid. The Italians founded the Salesian Roman Catholic Church, Mary Help of Christians, and the Ukrainians founded the Roman Catholic Church of St. George's, first on East 20th Street in 1905, and then to East 7th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues in 1911 as their numbers increased. St. Brigid continued to serve the community where it stood, though the dwindling of its community through the dwindling of its community, the priest strove and won to pay off its debts and to keep it going. Its clergy served the congregation. The homeless were welcome, labor leaders, civil rights protesters, the new Latin immigrants, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans. None were turned away, and St. Brigid addressed itself not to what was before, but to the parish's current needs. By 1960s, the parishioners were mostly Puerto Rican Latinx attending the morning service in Spanish while the 6 p.m. service was in English. Next slide. In 2001, the Committee to Save St. Brigid was formed to save St. Brigid. In 2001, the Archdiocese decided to close the church because a crack had appeared in the back wall. I don't know if you can see, it's the back window. The crack went from the roof all the way down the side of the window, and it looked like the whole thing was just going to go. It started when they were driving the piles for Eastville Gardens on the corner of 8th and C. Okay, so at any rate, when the crack appeared along the back wall, services were held in the parish house and in St. Brigid School auditorium. In 2004, the Archdiocese was advised to reduce its real estate portfolio, and it was decided to deconcentrate St. Brigid Parish, even though the parishioners had raised over $103,000 to repair the church. The Archdiocese sent a letter to the parishioners advising them to find another parish, and as they only had 167 members. The letter was read to the parishioners at their Sunday service. They were shocked, and the Committee to Save St. Brigid was formed by parishioners and joined by neighborhood activists and many Irish Americans to save the church. The EVCC donated $5,000 to procure the services of an attorney, Harry Kresge, to file a lawsuit to stop the destruction. Rosie Mendez, the New York City Council representative, active at that time, was contacted, and she offered to let the committee members meet in her campaign office initially. And then the meetings were moved to the EVCC office and Roland Lejuria Laura's office across the street from St. Brigid. Next slide. In July of 2006, the neighborhood awoke to the sounds of Russo and Sons knocking a hole into the back wall of the church. Committee members surrounded the church. DOB was contacted and sent an inspector who issued a stop work order. The attorney filed for a temporary restraining order and the demolition was halted. You can see what we saw. Elizabeth Roth actually called me at 7 o'clock in the morning to say they're knocking a hole in the back of St. Bridget's. So we started calling everybody. We all trooped out and we surrounded the church. We were holding hands, saying prayers. Jerome O'Connor, Edwin Torres were there arguing with the construction worker. Robert Slaughter was the person who called the Department of Buildings and said that, the wall could fall off any minute. They sent the representative, they issued a stop work order right away. So the church was saved at that point, at least temporarily. So next slide. Next slide, Richard. Oh, there we go. A decision was rendered on January 31st, 2006 by Judge Barbara Kapnick, which said that the issue of not-for-profit law regarding the formation of a board was not ripe for determination as the board had not been formed. An appeal was filed and heard on June 13, 2006, which supported Judge Kapnick's original decision. The committee was able to obtain a pro bono attorney, Marissa Marinelli of Holland and Knight, who, along with Harry Kresge, filed an amended complaint on August 24th, 2006, in front of Judge Kapnick. An argument was heard from both parties, with paper filed by both sides by early September 2006, plus Judge Kapnick asked for further argument in November of 2006. These are images of demonstrations that we had. This was in front of the courthouse. This is Carmen Pabon, Jimmy Samopoulos, Edwin Torres's grandchildren, Eric Rossi. Eric and Jimmy had helped to build the maquette for St. Brigid, which we carried around. My neighbor, Rob Gary, is the one who painted the banner for Save St. Brigid that we used to take to all the demonstrations. So next slide, please. The committee organized candlelight vigils, 2 marches on St. Patrick's Cathedral and the Archdiocese, numerous art auctions, and a Bards for St. Brigid performance to pay for legal and court filing fees, and demonstrations in front of the New York Supreme Court at Foley Square. Many Irish Americans responded to the call to save St. Brigid by serving on the Committee to Save St. Brigid, organizing events such as the art auctions and the Bards for St. Brigid, a well-attended performance event which featured music, prose, and poetry by well-known Irish bands, performers such as Larry Kerwin and Black 47, writers such as Pete Hamill, Colin McCann, Peter Quinn, to name a few. The money raised from these events paid our legal fees and court fees. Next slide. A donor gave $20 million to revive the historic church. In May of 2008, an anonymous donor donated $20 million to repair St. Brigid, $10 million to restore the building, $2 million to establish an endowment for the parish so that it might be best used to meet the religious and spiritual needs of the people living in the community, and $8 million to support St. Brigid's School and other Catholic schools in need. Rumors swirled that Matt Dillon, who had advocated for saving St. Brigid, was the anonymous donor, but this was refuted by both Dillon and the Archdiocese. Because of the donation and the Archdiocese's acceptance and agreement to restore the church, the pending appeal was not filed. Next slide. St. Brigid, St. Emerick. The church was renovated by Atchison and Doyle, architects, and reopened January 27, 2013, just in time for the feast day of St. Brigid on February 1st. The restored church was officially consecrated and dedicated by Cardinal Timothy M. Dolan as St. Brigid, St. Emerick, as St. Emerick's had been closed by the diocese and its parishioners were joined with St. Brigid Parish. The parish continues to operate today, and we're all really grateful that it's still that the building still graces Tompkins Square Park, still inspires people, and is a testament to people that want to preserve. So, at any rate, I think, Richard, it's on to you with your slides.
I think we're going to have questions now.
Okay, all right.
We fairly efficiently answered the questions earlier for Susan. And Susan, do you want to just talk about the where we can see the stained glass window in Florida? And then there are some comments in the chat, obviously, about what a sad moment in Irish history the draft riots were in American Irish history. So if you have any thoughts for us there.
Yeah, I had just looked up that Florida museum where the piece is called Dark Beauty, but it's known as the Geneva Window. And now I'm trying to scroll up to, it's like the Wolf, I think it's the last name of the collector. The Wolfsonian Museum in Miami is where the Geneva Window is. So the Geneva Window is what is known as, because the government was purchasing it, I think, to give as a gift to Geneva, but it's called Dark Beauty. Yeah, and it's an incredible piece. Yeah, the draft riots, Carolyn and I were talking about that, and I'm glad she referred to it. It's, it's been interesting to me how things have changed even in Ireland today in recent years. But the draft riots, I don't actually know all the details about them, except I know it happened even as close to me as, I think, Avenue A, there was fighting. And I was reading some of that history in the last few days because Carolyn and I were reading lots of history to make sure we had the details for the presentation. But in that, Daniel O'Connell was a great leader, and he was an anti-racist and fighting for liberty of all peoples. But not all Irish people in America felt that way, and they started to strain and say, well, we're not going to send you money. Now, he never wavered. In fact, during the Great Hunger, Frederick Douglass traveled to Ireland and saw and wrote about the experience of Irish people in Ireland at that time dying of hunger. So they were fast friends. So there were many people who were inspired by other ideas and trying to bring other ideas to the fore. And yet there were leaders trying to divide all the time, trying to, bring these other messages that weren't about coming together and making people's lives and places better, but dividing them and blaming. It's a kind of addictive behavior in an addictive system that we live in. Even today, we see it, that you point the finger at one group and say, that's the reason why you're feeling this way. And it's a way of, dividing and conquering.
I just wanted to add to that. You have to look at it in the context about how people were living. And the draft riots occurred after the Battle of Gettysburg, where there had been a lot of casualties. I think at one point, one thing that I read said that the Fighting 69th had started out with like 3,000 soldiers. And then by the time they came back, I think they had 1,500 and some odd left. That's a lot of people to go. I mean, that's more than the 755, which the article quoted too. But it's, I think, looking in context of what was going on in the neighborhood, that in the 1840s, 1850s, the Irish community was still being targeted by the nativists and threatened and actively campaigned against. And yet they were serving in the Civil War, that they sent 3,000 men to fight in the South. And then it came back that they were going to be drafted as well if they couldn't afford $300 to buy their way out. And I think that, it was a very crazy time. People were just really upset.
Thanks, Carolyn. Someone just put into the chat that New York City draft riots by Ivor Bernstein is a really good and dense book on the subject if people wanted to check it out more. So we have a couple other questions along that line. Victoria Dawson is saying that she was in the first graduating class at St. Emerick, and it was devastating to her when the church was absorbed. It's a similar thing, we actually had two thriving congregations, and a decision was made above everyone's head that it had to be one or the other, right?
Yeah, it was sad because it was just, the parishioners at St. Emerick's loved their church and they wanted to have it. I mean, the same way that St. Brigid and people that went there wanted to preserve the church. We got a lot of flack from various and sundry things that, for saying that it was the Famine church and that it was built but it was, and it was just the way that it came together and the fact that we were so intense about preserving the parish that we really fought for it. And it was just, that this was something that was really important for our neighborhood to preserve this building.
Carolyn, a couple folks are asking about the steeples. What happened to them? Was it considered?
The steeples were taken down in 1865. 1965. They were considered a hazard. A lot of the churches in Manhattan have had their steeples removed. Calvary, St. George's, Ascension.
Okay.
They considered them one, and with the earlier ones, with Calvary, I know they were considered a fire hazard because they were wood. We fought to try to get the steeples put back on St. Brigid because we thought it was really important. Roland went so far as to contact a fabricator who said that he could fabricate lightweight metal steeples that would be able to withstand the wind and that wouldn't increase the weight. And the architect said, no, we can't do that because of, the consistency of the soil and the weight on the church and things like that. The same way that they didn't put the bell back inside of the bell tower, that they put the bell in front of the church on the ground. But also they put an
I knew you would know. Thank you. And then Francie Scanlon is mentioning that there's a website called womensactivismnyc.com, and she has a tribute that she wrote this past August on St. Bridget that references the miracle of her namesake, if other people are interested. So we have a lot of things to comb through in the chat to send on the follow-up to this. And I think we are pretty much wrapped up. I hope I didn't miss anything critical. And if I did, then we have one more, which is that Stuart said he's interested in hearing for the first time from Susan that Catholicism in Ireland was a religion of the middle class and not so much of the poor. How did that come about and how did it change over time?
Well, thanks for your question, Stuart. And that's something I've been interested in, and I just looked it up again the other day for this because I came across a statistic late last year that something like 30% of Ireland were regular churchgoers before the famine. And the reason that changed was for many reasons, as I outlined, in terms of social changes, but also so many died, so many emigrated, and of those left, many were in towns and cities. And that would have been where most of the church going was happening. It was such a social thing. But that's what I understand about it. And I have taken note of the article where I read that, so I'll put that in the list of references from I got the information. Most of it was stuff I kind of knew because I had read it stuff before, but I've gone back to all the articles so that I can bring together actual references with academic research behind this. But that was something that was very interesting to me. Also, I know that there's a text I know from Scotland that I often go to that has a lot of poems, runes, prayers, because a lot of Irish knowledge was oral, even from the Druids, but a lot of people obviously at that time were not literate. So a lot of knowledge was handed down orally, and a man called Alexander Carmichael collected them in the late 1800s in Scotland, which is very similar to what we had in Ireland. And the person who collected them in Ireland did it a little later and not as extensively. Douglas Hyde, who ended up becoming the first president of Ireland. But he has a number of books published around 1900, religious songs of Connacht, love songs of Connacht, and it was a lot of that lore. And you can tell that some of it is pre-Christian in origin, and they might have put Mary and Joseph and different characters in there. So that's a rich resource for me.
That's great. I think we have one last question for Carolyn, which is, there had been talk at one point of a museum of Irish history within the church. Is that something you know about? No.
I don't know anything about that. I never heard.
Okay. That ended up on the cutting room floor, apparently.
Yeah.
But this has been fantastic. So we'll let Richard wrap it up.
Yes, thank
whenever
you,
he's
Laura.
ready.
And thank you so much, Carolyn and Susan. That was wonderful. Most East Village residents that I know love St. Brigid's and the other religious institutions in the East Village, Lower East Side. And unfortunately, these buildings, which are actually community treasures as far as we're concerned, are very vulnerable to demolition and redevelopment, typically as high cost luxury housing. Here are some examples of East Village churches that have been lost over the years. And we at Lesby and also EVCC, I think it's fair to say, want to push to make sure that we don't lose more of them. Here are some surviving examples. Tragically, the Middle Collegiate Church, Middle Church, just burnt down this year, but hopefully it'll be resurrected. So for those of you who missed some or all of tonight's presentation, including if you know somebody who was not able to get in tonight to the presentation, we will be posting it on our YouTube channel along with other past webinars that we presented. If you go into Lesby's website, which is at the address is on the lower left, you'll see a link to our Lesby YouTube site and see some of the many webinars that we have posted there. And this will be up probably within a week or two. You can also just do a search on the computer for Lower East Side Preservation Initiative YouTube channel. So please keep an eye open for future Lesby webinars, including lectures and book talks, and hopefully sometime in the not too distant future, live walking tours and other events. Some of you may remember live events. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up to date with what's going on with Lesby, including our events, as well as preservation issues in general on the Lower East Side. And although these are difficult times, please consider making a donation today to Lesby and/or EVCC. We need donations to help us to continue to produce webinars such as this one and to continue our advocacy work for preservation of the East Village and Lower East Side. You can find a donate button on your original invitation to this event and at the websites shown here. So I want to thank you again all for attending. Thank you to our panelists and everybody, and please have a good night and stay safe.
Thanks,
you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.